Fantastic, Marc. Good to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.
Marc, by the way, before we talked a little bit before we hit the record button, but I forgot to ask you one question because you read, you wrote a lot of books, very interesting books. You are a frequent contributor to Seeking Alpha. You're writing a blog. And you're also having a full-time job. And whenever I turn the TV on, you are on Bloomberg. So can we just talk quickly about your productivity secrets?
Yeah, it's really a question I think of being like a old man. That I've been doing this for a long time. So it's sort of like watching a soap opera that you don't see necessarily every day, but then you're flipping through the channels and you see the soap opera and you remember the characters. And so for me, it's I really had fallen in love with the foreign exchange market before I even knew anything about it. I had read this, an Italian writer, Parabani, Riccardo Parabani. He wrote a book called The Dollar and Its Rivals. And he was writing in the late 70s, early 80s about how capitalist countries weren't going to war with each other anymore, thankfully, but that they were having their expressing conflicts of national interest through the foreign exchange market.
Interesting.
And I thought this is where I want. This is it gave me a framework. And so when I got out of school, I had 2 master's degrees. One's in American history, and my reading of American history just took me further and further along in the story until I entered the 20th century. And to appreciate American history, 20th century, is to really understand international relations. So I did another master's in international relations, focusing on political economy. And when I got out of school, the only skill that I had that someone was willing to buy was I could write. So I became a journalist on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, covering the currency futures and the Eurodollar T-Build futures. And I tell you, it was funny about it too, because despite knowing a little bit about the markets, I thought there I was going to go on my first day at work on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I said, but don't they trade livestock there? Right. Live cattle, pork bellies. And I thought, my God, what kind of place is this going to be? And then I realized it was a very important, aha moment, where I realized that everything's traded on paper certificates, which is really a step closer to this new world that we live in now, of a digitalized world. So, but I found out as a journalist, I was not really necessarily a good journalist because I had what you'd expect any young person with 2 master's degrees to have, an opinion. And so I found that Wall Street pays people to have an opinion. And thankfully, you don't have to be right. You have to be thoughtful. You have to have some reasons for your ideas. You have to be part of a dialogue. But being right is almost secondary to having something informed to say and a way for people to make money on your ideas.
Right.
Even if you're wrong all the time, people try to appreciate that. They know when you say that's going up, they know to go the opposite way. So I think it's just through passion for trying to understand what's going on. I mean, if someone would have told me that I would be able to get paid for following current events, I mean, my own family doesn't care what I think about current events, and so it's really for me it's a real luxury, and I enjoy it, which is why a lot of guys my age during COVID have retired, and I still have this. I still wake up in the morning thinking, "Wow, what happened while I was sleeping?"
Yeah, I can see that. And the funny thing is about the Italian economist that you mentioned. It's similar to what Edward Luttwak, right, came up with geoeconomics. So, by now I would say we are at this point. Maybe after the unipolar world with Krauthammer and the US was the boss, and then came Samuel Huntington, and what kind of vision we're gonna have. But by now, it seems, looking at financial sanctions, looking at all sorts of de-globalization and this and that kind of topics, that at the end of the day, now nations are in some sort of competition. Maybe because this unipolar moment is fading. Any views on that? When we start big picture?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I have that realist basis that the international world is sort of almost like the Hobbesian view of nature, of man and nature. It's the strongest prevail, and there's the rules are. I mean, of course, like to the unipolar moment, yes, the U.S. To me, the story is that the U.S. helped shape the rules at Bretton Woods. And it was really the U.S. negotiator, Harry Dexter White, against Keynes.
Right.
And Keynes represented the debtors of the world, and the U.S. represented the creditor of the world. And I think that creditor-debtor clash, the U.S. wins that as the world, even though, yeah, it wins that battle. The dollar is pegged to gold. Everybody else pegs to the dollar. And then that system broke down for various reasons. And partly it wasn't so much the Soviet Union demanding U.S. gold. It was our allies in Europe that wanted more of the gold than the U.S. wanted to part with.
The French.
And
You can say
especially
it.
the French, right? And so Nixon closed the gold window, and you'll remember this date, August 22nd, 1971, because this August 22nd, the BRICS are meeting, and there's a lot of talk that that is to say, the BRICS are meeting on the anniversary of the end of Bretton Woods. And there's talk that they want to have a new world system based on their own currency that some people think are going to come about. And so for me, this kind of world that we live in, the U.S., the Bretton Woods system broke down. We didn't know where we were going. And then in the late 70s, by the early 80s, it was clear. Reagan and Thatcher offered a new system, a liberal type of liberal, meaning favor of capitalism. This liberal system was extended, a new type of system. The dollar was floating, free mobility of capital, weaker trade unions domestically. And this lasted, I think, until the Great Financial Crisis. And the Great Financial Crisis, I think, ended this Reagan-Thatcher type of order. And because that order, to your point, that order broke down, I think that the rivalries sort of escalated again. Growth of different issues, different interests, and also the weakening of the collectivity, whether it's the IMF, World Bank, GATT, which gets replaced by the WTO. And so that's why I think we are in this place here, like where we're sort of competing for what's going to be the new financial architecture in the world.
Right. And I mean, if you think about, because there's a lot of talk, right? Like, I mean, it comes up every couple of months or years. There's some sort of new initiative. It was the gold-backed RMB or like futures contract in Shanghai, like 2 years ago or whatever. Now it's the BRICS currencies, and there will be probably like some other kind of de-dollarization stories. When you think about the US dollar structural place in the global economy, like what do you think? Like, what's the place right now, and why it's still the place that it's gonna, have for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think throughout my whole career, and even probably before that, I'd say people were looking for an alternative to the dollar. I think about the birth of the SDR, the special drawing rights at the IMF, comes about to help supplement, not supplant, but supplement the dollar. And we have this Triffin paradox that I think people are wrestling with, and that is that as the nation, like the U.S., provides the reserve asset, dollars, treasury bonds, the more the U.S. has to go into debt to do so. And the more debt there is, eventually undermines the credibility of the currency. That's the sort of heart of the issue. And and I think also there's another like political aspect here too, where nobody likes to bully in their neighborhood. And the U.S., with the dollar being so dominant, of course, nationalistic forces around the world won't necessarily like that. They want to have their currency, like President of Brazil, Lula, had said, like, why should the dollar be it? Like, who picked it? How did we have this happen? And so I think so. So one point I'd say is, yes, there seems to be always a search for an alternative. Secondly, I'd say that throughout my career, it's turned out to be like pretenders. Early on in my career, say the second half of the 80s, Japanese yen. People thought Japan was the world's largest creditor nation, the largest exporter, that the world was going to be dominated by the Japanese. And of course, that didn't happen. And then the birth of the euro gave us an economic area, an economy that could rival the U.S. And I remember people saying, now that there's an alternative, it's going to be the euro. And a few years down the road, when that became obviously not going to be the case, I remember reading a money center bank's research suggesting that it's going to be crypto. That was going to be the future. And this was for institutional, not just for the retail community, but for institutional investors. They should be buying crypto and putting it in their reserves, treasury reserves or nation state reserves. And so now I think, of course, that to your point, that the RMB has captured people's imaginations, size of the economy, but also since 9/11, the U.S. has been increasingly using sanctions, first after going after terrorist financing, but it's obviously maybe since Russia invaded Ukraine, it's become much bigger and perhaps even to the point where even some of the U.S. allies might be afraid if they would be cited or sanctioned. And so I think about like Singapore, which is at the same time it's buying U.S. fighter jets for defense. It's also buying more gold and storing the gold, not in the U.S., not at the Federal Reserve at Fort Knox, but they're storing it in Singapore. In case they get sanctioned, they could draw on it in a way that, of course, Russia cannot draw on its gold that it had in the U.S. or Europe, for that matter. So I think that the sanction regime is also encouraging people to look for alternatives or alternatives to either to hold their savings or location of that. And then I think there's also this other thing that's happened that's sort of, I kind of like that concept of being overdetermined, that there's many factors that are driving this rather than just one cause. And one thing that has also happened, of course, is technology, the advancement in technological payment systems. So you think about what happens. I can go on to, say, a website, a retail website, and I could use their credit card. I could use my own personal credit card. I could use their credit, their store credit that you earn, or I could use PayPal. Well, perhaps there'll be additional different payment systems that we could use, and that's what countries have developed. So Brazil has a payment system. China does. The Fed just starting this month in July, the Fed's it's called Fed Now, which allows instantaneous payment settlements between banks in the U.S. for the first time. So this technological advancement has sort of lowered the barriers to payment systems that allow other currencies to join that system. So when Australia sells iron ore to China, do they really need to do it in dollars? They do it in RMB or Australian dollars. And I think that's what we're going to find is that as economist types, right, we think about different functions of money. And one of them is a store of value, the other is a transactional vehicle, and the other is a unit of account. Let's leave aside the unit of account. That's just how we price things. So the real issue here, I think, is as a store of value and a transactional vehicle. And what I suspect is going to happen is a dollar's role as a transactional vehicle that could lighten up, that could be reduced, but it's as a store of value that I think it's going to remain very strong. And I think that as a store of value, I'm thinking about central banks' reserves. I'm thinking about this smell test I sometimes used to do when I was younger, going to a foreign country and getting a taxi from the airport to the hotel, and telling the taxi driver that I didn't have any of the local currency yet on me, would they take dollars? And I never was turned down for a taxi driver taking US dollars from me. I have tried other currencies, and they told me no, that they know where an ATM is. So I think that as a store of value, as a sort of a universal language, I don't want to be like ethnocentric and say English is the universal language, because I know it's not. But I do find that more people speak English around the world than might speak some dialect, Hindu dialect, or.
Oh, sure,
so
it's
I
a
think
network effect. Yeah,
can sort of be like that too, the broad networking effect. And so, but besides, there's a lot of other structural issues we could talk about. But on a big picture point of view, I think that we could see the dollar lose some of its transactional use, but still be a source of value.
Yeah, because I think that's what pretty much people are really talking about. They are really not so much talking about the store of value function here. So like, let's think about, okay, about like some of the structural factors then on the store of value front. Like let's assume that like you are Xi Jinping. How would you kind of like lower the the structural value of the dollar in favor of an RMB, or does it even make any strategic sense to do so?
Yes, no, I think that is exactly the kind of thinking that we have to do, is not just think from our own perspective. I mean, if it's sort of like a big game. Sometimes they call these international relations the great game. And the way that it seems to me that in a lot of games, it's not just thinking about what you do on your side or your team or what you personally do, but also what the other person's going to do.
Right.
And I think that we often lose sight of that because we get stuck in it with our own agenda in our head, and we forget that it's a game where there's an action, a reaction, and then an action back and forth. And it's really, in game theory, if you have a one-off game, it makes sense to burn your opponent. But if you have infinite number of games, there's some regularities. And like you think about those stories of those soldiers on the Western Front who took a break for Christmas, even have a soccer match before they go back into their foxholes and shoot each other. And so that kind of cooperation happens, ironically, when you have these like infinite number of games. And I think that in those kind of situations, which I think international relations are, you have to really be thinking about what your adversary is going to do. And so if I was going to suggest like how could we because I don't think the dollar's role of the store of value is diminishing quickly. If I was an adversary of the U.S., thinking, well, how could I make it happen quicker?
And the reason why I'm really asking is because like I think like everyone is by now assuming, okay, de-dollarization is going to happen eventually. At the same time, when people say, oh, it's not happening for the foreseeable future, there's no alternative to the dollar, then everyone is saying, well, eventually it has to happen. So there needs to be some sort of change. So that's I think why we want to kind of dig into the change. So let's make the change, Marc.
Yeah. So I think that there's two ways that change can take place.
All right.
And one I'd say is abdication. The U.S. says, this responsibility is too great. It's not worth it anymore. We're just going to be the master of our own house. We don't want to have the dollar being the world's reserve currency. We don't necessarily want the Federal Reserve to be acting like the world's central bank. So, and I think there's some people who, the French have called it an exorbitant privilege. Mm-hmm. You have the dollar have this role, and some people are saying that it's like an unfair price. It's a burden, the burden of the dollar's rule. And so I can see an abdication where, like here, remember what happens after World War I. Wilson negotiates the League of Nations, but he could convince the world, but he couldn't convince the U.S. Senate. And so the U.S. wasn't part of the League of Nations. And even now, some of the important international treaties, like the World Court of Justice, mm-hmm. The law of the seas, and most recently, it's not a law, but most countries have disavowed the use of cluster bombs, and yet that's what the U.S. has been providing to Ukraine. And so, I sort of think that the abdication comes from the U.S. saying, if the IMF and the World Bank don't do what we want, and Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, recently said that those multilaterals act as a guardrail against China. No longer are they these referees, but they're actually participants in this in the great game. And I think that by abdication, I think there's political forces in the U.S. that we could see even come to a higher surface next year in the presidential election, mm-hmm. Where I think the discussion about funding Ukraine, about the activist foreign policy that we have, comes into question again. So there's a whole thing of this abdication where the U.S. withdraws rather than the encroachment, which is the alternative. And encroachment would be some country or a group of countries try to take that away from the U.S. by how do you take over? Like, how does Pepsi compete with Coke? A product differential, theoretically, right? And so whoever wants to have an alternative to the dollar has to have. It can't just be a little bit better. We all use the same keyboard, QWERTY. I'm told that there's better ergonomically designed keyboards where your fingers can move even less. But for us to learn that, there's a first mover advantage. It can't just be a little bit better. It's got to be a lot better. And I think that when we're thinking about how can what say China can do to really compete with the dollar's role as a store of value, a couple of things occur to me. One is China's currency is not freely available. We in the economic financial world would say it's not convertible. That is, the RMB is only onshore. Offshore, they trade a parallel currency. We call it the offshore RMB. We use the symbol CNH for it. Onshore RMB, CNY. And it's hard. You have to go through regulatory steps to go from one to the other. And so typically, if you're like a U.S. business that I might advise, and they might be expecting payments in they might have to make a payment in U.S. dollars, but at a fixed RMB amount, and they might hedge themselves using that CNH, that offshore RMB, rather than the onshore. And so if I was going to advise President Xi, he said to me, how can I really challenge the dollar? How can I make my RMB a true competitor? Leaving aside the Americans shooting themselves in the foot, what could I do? Say, first, make the currency convertible. Secondly, which would allow you to combine the two exchange rates, basically. These two, the offshore and the onshore just merge in effect. And you liberalize, you let people come in and out of the country like the US does, or other, like, say, European countries, Japan, very light regulation on investing inside the country and for businesses to take their profits outside the country.
Right.
But the other thing I would do too is it's not just that dollars are held in reserves as a store of savings by other countries. They don't really hold dollars so much as they hold U.S. Treasury bonds. And the U.S. Treasury bond is the federal government's bond. It's the biggest, deepest bond market. And what that means then is, see what the alternatives are. So there's a common currency in Europe, right, the euro, but the bond markets haven't been united, which means that it's more like the U.S. municipal bond market, where you have a lot of small issuers, generally small issuers, and each issuer has its own like idiosyncratic rules, how to play their game with their bond market. It's not the same as a unified federal government bond market like we have in the U.S. We have a muni market, state bonds, city bonds, municipal government bonds, but that's not the same thing as the federal government's bonds. China doesn't really what they have is a lot of state governments, regional governments' debt, and they don't even have a direct debt. They basically had to create these special purpose vehicles to take on the debt. So it's almost, in some ways, more sophisticated or advanced, or just as advanced as funding of U.S. companies with different branches, subsidiaries, different relationships. What China needs to really rival the U.S., besides more transparent, open access markets, is a deeper federal government bond market. And that's also achievable in some ways. In the U.S., the musical that caught a lot of people's imaginations was a Hamilton. And Hamilton in the U.S., one of the founders, what he wanted to do is nationalize the state's debts. We called it the assumption. Nationalization sounds bad to the American ear, perhaps. We called it assumption, where the federal government assumes the state's debts. And which is a similar type of thing that down the road they might have to do in China as well. But to me, those are the two big things that if I was China, how I would really compete with the U.S. I'd say I'd open up my markets, make them more transparent, more accessible, and make a big bond market that can compete with U.S. Treasuries.